As an African-American woman lawyer, who are your role models?
Oh, there's so many. You know, there have been so many people in my life who are people with courage and vision, but also people who have been willing to be helpful. And I think of Eleanor Farrer, with whom I worked for many years. She ran the Washington office of the Metropolitan Applied Research Center, which was an organization that was headed by Ken Clark. And, you know, I worked with Eleanor, I think it was 6 years. Eleanor was amazing. You know, she was an academic by profession. She had a PhD from the London School of Economics. She had taught, but she was also very interested and committed to issues of civil rights, even though she was Austrian. But she had experienced Hitler. Her family had experienced Hitler, and they had fled, and she'd gotten to this country. And she was very committed to issues of race and gender. And so she was a fabulous role model. Working for her, she sort of helped me understand how to balance work and family, and shared with me some of her experiences in that regard. She had 4 children. Somehow she managed to have them all over summer break from university life. I don't understand how that works. I guess that's good planning or something, better than I've ever done. But in any case, people like Eleanor, people like Vernon, who for years, he's always been there if I needed somebody to bounce ideas off of. I needed advice, I needed some guidance. People like Kenneth Clark, who really desperately did not want me to go to law school because he thought, you know, the legal model was a bit of a failed model, and his preference would have been for me to go and get my PhD as he had. But at some point he said, you know, I really don't want you to do it, but God damn it, if you're going to do it, I'll do anything I can to help you. And but he was so important because he was the reminder to me of our continuing obligation. I think probably till his last breath, you know, he cared about matters of race. He cared about matters of poverty. He cared about matters of equality. He was the constant reminder that we always have to be vigilant. We always have to be sensitive to those who are less fortunate than ourselves. There just were so many people. There are people, judges on this court in the District of Columbia, who encouraged me to do things like run for bar president. People like Jim Roberts and Paul Friedman, who were really big supporters of mine. And, you know, it didn't occur to me to run for bar president. I said, well, why not? And I said, well, I'm not my ideal of a bar president. And they, well, why not? So, you know, there have just been a lot of people who've been very, very important to me, who've been in my corner.
You are the first African-American female bar president. Has there been any since you?
Not in the District of Columbia.
And were you not the first African-American president of any state bar in the country?
African-American female, yes. There had been African-American bar presidents, because you may recall that Fred Abramson was president of D.C. Bar. So he probably was one of the very first.
Well, what was that experience like?
It was an interesting experience. Our bar is an unusual bar. There are some significant limits on what the bar can do, what it can engage in using dues money. So to a certain extent, the agenda that you can engage in as bar president gets to be more limited than it might be in other jurisdictions. But as the first African American female, I think I got invitations to speak that otherwise I might not have. It took a lot more time than I expected. I gave a lot more speeches than I enjoyed. And I will say candidly that by the end of the year I was doing much better giving speeches than when I started. It was a very worthwhile experience. I learned a lot about the bar, a lot about the bar's membership. Some of the things I learned were disappointing because I thought then and I think now that ours is a bar where a lot of people are not committed to the district as a community. They're happy to be members of the bar here. They're happy to be successful here, but they're not really committed to this community to make what I think are real important and necessary contributions that each of us should be making to our communities. I don't think that we have the luxury of simply coming here and earning our money and not giving back to the community. And I found that this bar was less willing than I had hoped they would be in terms of doing things like mentoring kids or going into schools or engaging in some of the projects that I would have liked to have seen them engage in.
So explain the limitations on the DC bar versus the other bars.
Because we're a mandatory bar, our dues revenues can only be used for limited purposes. We can use it for the lawyer admissions and counseling and discipline, and for the administration of the courts. Anything like pro bono activities has to be paid for from non-dues revenues. So the bar has to raise money in other ways. That's why annually they have a big fundraiser around the incoming president. They usually do a reception to honor the incoming president, and that's where they raise a lot of their money. And they always are looking for contributions from law firms and from individuals to do all the other things that a lot of the other bars can do.
So what was your greatest accomplishment as bar president?
One of the projects that we did actually was awarded the best bar project in the country that year by the National Conference of Bar Presidents. And it was a project that I called reproductive cancer. What I tried to do was to come up with a project that could engage both men and women, that could engage both people of color and whites, but could benefit broadly folks in the district. The district has very high incidence of cancer, prostate cancer among men and breast cancer for women, and they're disproportionately high in the African American community. And one of the things I thought would be useful is to see if we could get the bar engaged in doing things like helping people who are victims of cancer to develop, for instance, agreements with respect to what happened to their children should something happen to them. We developed some simple legal services for people with cancer. We also helped with some of the treatment issues where you're dealing with insurance companies that don't want to pay for certain kinds of treatment. We developed some standard forms and consents. for use in the hospitals. One of the people who was one of the co-chairs of the task force happened to be the general counsel at MedStar Health, who was an African American at the time, and saw great value in this for his institution and thought it would have value for other institutions. So it actually turned out to be quite a successful project, and it was also to raise awareness. So we did some educational messaging around breast cancer awareness and prostate cancer awareness. So it was very, very successful.
And you won an award for it?
Yes, there's something called the National Conference of Bar Presidents, and it's a national organization made up of the presidents of the bars, voluntary and mandatory bars around the United States, and they each year come up with the best bar project, and this was one of the ones that was submitted and won an award. Yeah.
Tell us about the demands of being a single parent during your school years, but in particular during your work years.
Well, being a single parent isn't easy under any circumstance, whether you're working or not working. It's just not easy. The thing about being a single parent is that 24/7, you cannot make a decision on doing almost anything unless you first figure out what the implication of that decision is for your children. So whether it is go take a shower now, well, where are the kids? Are they inside or outside? Depending on their age, who's going to pay attention to them while you're in the shower? Or, when you need to go to the grocery store, or if you want to go out to dinner or to a movie or something. So at some point it can become very overwhelming. On balance, however, I was a fortunate one in the sense that I made a decision pretty early on, particularly after I graduated from law school, that I would have a live-in person so that I would have more flexibility to be able to do my work, but also ensure that my kids were looked after. It also helped me from the perspective of the person who looked after my children usually fixed dinner for them. So if I was late, they weren't going to suffer. To the extent that when I was at the White House in particular, I had more traveling to do. To the extent that person was live-in, it was easier to have someone at the house and not have to worry about making alternate arrangements. You give up a lot, you give up your privacy, and it costs more to have somebody live in. But the benefits were outweighed the cost and what you gave up to do it. It was tough, but I wouldn't trade my kids, so it's the price you pay for parenthood.
What was the most trying time as a single parent for you?
I'm not sure what the most trying time was. There were times when I did feel overwhelmed by the demands of a job and children and things they wanted to do and that might compete with things I wanted to do or things I was required to do for my job. I think the most trying time, however, probably came around, and it probably has less to do with being a single parent as just the challenges of raising young people as they're approaching adulthood and they're asserting their wings and things like I remember once my daughter asked whether she could join some of her friends who were going to go to a march against the Star Wars program that Reagan was proposing. And so I said, well, it was a school day, and I said, well, no, Suzanne. All right, well, I said, tell me what you know about the Star Wars program. She says, well, it's something, but it was clearly not correct. And I said, well, Suzanne, it seems to me you don't really know enough about this program to really have formed a judgment that you want to go down and protest against it. And so, no, you can't take the day off just from school to go down to this protest march. And so she left to go to school, and I left to go to work. And about 10:30 in the morning, I was in a client meeting, and I get a call from my secretary to tell me that the police were on the line. They needed to speak with me. And so it was, this is Sergeant so-and-so from the 3rd District. We have your daughter in custody. She was arrested with some other kids down at this march. I was just livid. Here I am in a client meeting, and she deliberately disobeyed me, did exactly what I told her she could not do. I was tempted to leave her at the jail. I dutifully excused myself from the meeting and went to get my daughter. And
how old was she at the time?
Oh, probably 14. And she had become really good friends with this young woman whose parents were, I say 60s hippies, that's not fair, but her father then, and maybe still does today, ran a coalition to ban handguns. And it was one of these situations where the children called the parents by the first name, and it was all very loosey-goosey, and I wasn't real thrilled about that. And but they were out demonstrating, and they had been arrested, and so I had to go get the kid out of jail. And so times like that are quite trying. But I'm not sure it has much to do with single parenting as it is, the tensions between parents and children about who's in charge.
And the greatest achievement as a parent and as a lawyer, what do you think were your greatest achievements?
I'm very fortunate. I have 2 kids who have deliberately chosen not to be what their parents were, but have been successful at doing what they wanted to do. My son has an MBA from NYU, and he is the director of finance of Wine and Spirits magazine. It's a position that is significantly less stressful than some of his prior work as an investment banker and stuff, but he really enjoys it, and he gets to do a lot of wine tastings, and that's fun too, I'm sure. But he's happy with that. And my daughter, wanted to be an academic. She's done all the coursework. She just ABD, everything but the dissertation. But she's currently running a film festival in New York City, and she loves it, and that's sort of what she wants to do at the moment. So my children have had a luxury and a freedom that I did not have. I tell them this often. They've had the luxury and freedom to explore ideas and interests purely for intellectual pleasure and enrichment, and they've done it in a way that has been really important to them. Now, I tease them that they've had a safety net that some of us did not grow up with. So, the fact that I've worked continuously since I'm 14 is something that would be very foreign to them, although both of them did work pretty early. But we always have said, I think, that we want our kids to have a better life than we had. And I certainly feel that way. But I also am concerned and do believe that my kids are not halfway as tough as I am, and if they got into a real crisis, I'm not sure that they could emerge from it in quite as intact as I think maybe I have. Now that might be my own distorted notions of my own strengths and my own tenacity or viability, I don't know.
So you have worked continuously since you were 14?
Yeah.
You've never had 6 months off or a year off?
I had a little time off. My husband went to Vietnam. I was pregnant at the time. And so for a short period of time, I didn't work full time. I did some substitute teaching. I sold World Book encyclopedias, things like that. So I didn't work full time, but that's the only time since I was 14 that I haven't worked.
And even then you worked part-time?
Yeah, I did.
What would you do if you had a year's sabbatical from your firm?
I'd be crazy.
Would you imagine using a year to do something else? And if so, what would that be?
I have no idea. That question's come up a lot lately because, as you know, I recently changed law firms because my prior law firm had a mandatory 65 out of the partnership, and I didn't think I was ready to stop working. I love what I do. I love being engaged on a daily basis with people. I probably love being overcommitted, having too many things to do, you know? I'm not sure what I'd do. I'd probably spend time traveling. I'd probably spend lots of time in places like art galleries and antique stores and exploring places that I haven't been, or even going back to some places I've been before. But it's important for me to keep engaged physically and mentally, to keep my brain active. You know, when I was growing up, I guess this is an indication of my limitations. When I was growing up, my older sister was a voracious reader, and she'd, read late in the night and early in the morning, and I would spend my time doing things like making a dress. I could sew, and because at the end of the day, or at the end of 3 hours, I could see something tangible that I'd actually done, that I'd actually created, that I'd put together, that I could see and feel and touch. And while I'm not as driven in quite that way about seeing something tangible, I spend less time sitting and reading and things as I do out doing and looking and experiencing and feeling and touching and being engaged in a physical way.
Someone claims that there is a novel in every one of us.
Oh my God.
Is there a novel in you?
Yes, there's a novel in me.
If you were to write a book, what would you write about?
Well, no one's ever asked me that question before, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It probably, though, would be about a trip to someplace distant. I'd probably run into somebody I knew, too, because that happens to me all the time. I don't know, it might be an adventure novel involving travel and a recognition of how small the world is.
How difficult was it being the only African-American lawyer at Hunton and Williams?
Oh, I wasn't. I wasn't the only African-American lawyer at Hunton and Williams.
Were you the only African-American female lawyer there?
No, I was the first African-American female partner. I think I was the third African-American partner in the history of the firm, and the first female. And I think since then, we've had, Hunton had 2 other female partners. And I think at the moment they only have 1. I think there's only 1 left.
And how many partners were there?
In excess of 300.
So there came a time when you were the only African-American female partner of 300.
Yeah.
And there were maybe 2 other African-American male partners.
That's probably right, yeah.
How difficult was that?
You know, it is a truism of my life that I've often been the only one. So it probably wasn't a lot more difficult in that circumstance than it's been in other situations. From time to time, it was difficult. On the other hand, you know, success in economics sometimes causes some things to give way a little bit. So to the extent that I was quite visible in the Washington marketplace, I was reasonably successful in developing a practice. The economics were not insignificant. I think that mutes some of the issues that you might otherwise encounter. It wasn't, I did have from time to time an, you know, occasional issue. I can remember one partners meeting. We had breakout groups, and there was this one breakout session. It's going to deal with diversity. And one of my partners stood up and said something to the effect about how difficult it was to find qualified African Americans. And I simply said that I wish that anytime they talked about African Americans or diverse candidates, they wouldn't use the term qualified, because the firm only hired qualified lawyers, and I wasn't sure why they only used that adjective to describe diversity candidates. Well, you would have thought I'd smacked the poor guy in the face. But it was very troubling to me, because if you hear the conversation and you hear it repeatedly, it's almost always about how difficult it is to find qualified individuals. And we all know these major firms only hire qualified. So it just really is one of those irritants with me. I said it nicely, I thought, but he didn't think it was so nice.
So what did you do, if anything, at the firm to change things?
I think I can say, perhaps somewhat immodestly, that I had a very positive effect on diversity at Hunton. I can remember in 1994, we had the first minority retreat at Hunton and Williams. And at that time, there were 20 attorneys of color. And that's African American, Hispanic, Asian. In that group, I think there were 3 partners, and the rest were associates. And we got together, firm-sanctioned event. We started meeting on Friday, and we talked about the things that were really good about the firm and areas where we thought the firm could improve. On Saturday, we were joined by members of the executive committee, and those of us who were partners shared some of the concerns that had been developed. To the credit of the the executive committee members who were there, they listened. They asked us to prepare a report. It became a report that was considered by the executive committee, and the firm agreed to take certain actions to address some of the concerns we'd raised. What was fascinating to me, that meeting occurred in December, and then in April, the women partners met. And at that time, there were 22 women partners. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I was the only person who went to both meetings. And the women decided to take a page out of the minority attorney's book and to catalog their concerns. And at the end of the day, there was only one area in which the two groups came up with different areas of concern or recommendation, and that was work-life balance. The women were concerned about that, but both groups were concerned about mentoring, about the quality of their assignments, about being included in pitches, about making sure that if there was a bad matchup between a partner and an associate, that there was some way to intervene before it deteriorated to a level that couldn't be retrieved. So, in fairness to Hunton, they listened. They put mentoring programs in place. They put some support programs in place. They became very conscious of and very focused on issues of diversity. By 2004, when Diversity Magazine did an article in which I was the cover girl, I guess it was actually 2005, we had more than 100 attorneys of color. So Hunton there was a great success story. It is true that a substantial amount of the diversity came when we opened a Miami office, took some partners from a couple of other firms, so that our Miami office actually became a majority-minority office because of the large number of largely Cuban Americans, but there were some Puerto Ricans in that office, but it was largely Hispanic office. But it made great strides. It really did. And so, and I think that I think my nudging on some issues paid off. My group that has worked for me has always been diverse. I had a African-American woman partner who, she came as an associate. She eventually became the second female African-American partner at Hunton & Williams, and subsequently there was a third woman who came. I have a African-American man. I have a young woman who is actually of Croatian descent. And over the years, I've tried to have a diverse group. I've also been very sensitive to not wanting to create what some might perceive to be a ghetto or the only place where African Americans can go. And so from time to time, I've actually declined to have conversations with potential candidates because I didn't want to create that issue. I wanted the firm to broadly welcome attorneys of color in all of our practice groups, and they, you know, mine is a special practice area. We deal with a lot of state and local elected officials. Municipalities care, and they have been very active. Many of them have laws that require that their contracting be that some of their contracting be set aside for minority firms, or that we have joint ventures between a majority firm and a minority firm. So some of it is nudged on by the municipality. But But you know, our mayors and our governors are looking different than corporate America in many, many ways. And that has made a difference in terms of the practice I'm in.
So when you moved to Orrick, what was the diversity like there?
Orrick actually, statistically, is more diverse than Hunton. In 2005, it was ranked number 15 among the most diverse large law firms in the United States. But the interesting thing about Orrick's diversity is that it's very heavily Asian. So it's not as obvious in some ways as we tend to think of it in terms of people of color. But it's, I think currently there are only 2 African American women partners, one in New York and myself. And I believe there are only 3 African American male partners. There is at least 1 Asian female, and there are probably more than that. I mean, I was with one over the weekend, so I know she's Filipino. But so it's statistically more diverse, but it is very Asian oriented.
So you're the only African American female partner at Orrick in DC?
Yes.
And how is that?
It's fine. As I said, I've been there before, so it's not new.
You've never had difficulties with clients as an African American partner?
Not obviously. I'm sure some may have made decisions not to hire me because they chose, you know, they might have seen race as a factor or an impediment. I don't know that I've ever gotten the impression that someone's not hiring me because I was African American.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back and talk about the White House years. What was that like? How did you get in there and what did you do?
I'd like to say I was standing on the right street corner at the right time. I was practicing law at Aaron Fox, and I was doing litigation. And one day I got a call from this gentleman. His name was Jack Watson. He said, Pauline, I'm Jack Watson. I work for the president. I'm looking for a staff assistant, and someone has given me your name as somebody I should talk to. Would you be willing to talk to us? And I sort of flippantly said, well, I'll talk to anybody, you know? And so, you know, a few days later, I went over and interviewed at the White House, and within 30 days, I was on the staff over there. And it was a fabulous experience. It was during the Carter years, and I was in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, and it was the office that and Jack Watson, who was head of that office, also carried the additional role of secretary to the cabinet. And so we did 2 things, or 3 things. One, it was liaison with state and local elected officials. So I dealt primarily with mayors and governors, and it was a matter of communicating White House policy, getting their support, hopefully, of White House policy, being sensitive to and trying to be helpful of their desire to get various kinds of government resources, whether it was UDAG grants or things like that. I also was served as sort of the special liaison to the District of Columbia, because as you know, the district has always had a special relationship with the federal government. The district's budget initially is submitted to the president, who then submits it to Congress along with the federal budget. The White House appoints judges to our local courts. So they've always had a very important, and I would say intrusive, role in local government. And so that was an important piece of what I did. I also dealt with the territories, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern Marianas. The other piece of what we did was some interagency coordination, so that, for instance, when you had the Mariel boat lift and you had the Cubans coming into the United States on these boats, there was a need to coordinate government services to these people who were coming ashore. So it was an attempt to coordinate the services that might be delivered by HHS that had to be delivered through local governmental entities, coordinating, say, the correctional issues, because some of these people were released from prisons, and so they had to be, quote, rounded up and held and shipped back, coordinating educational programs so that the local governments were not being overburdened, and the Fed was assuming its responsibility for some of this. We did interagency coordination around things like minority contracting, the whole issue of small businesses and 8A certifications, and making sure the government was contracting, the president had created as a priority that the feds would contract with small and local businesses, and particularly disadvantaged business. So it was coordination, making sure the federal agencies were doing their share to be supportive of this. It was making sure, for instance, that government offices were locating in labor surplus areas, because that had become a priority, that federal offices should remain in our urban centers, and particularly in our urban centers where there was high unemployment rates, and that was supposed to spur economic development in these local areas. So it was a great experience. I've been very fortunate to have worked in the federal government and in the state, local government, the District of Columbia government, both times as political appointees. So I was able to go in at a level that's high enough so you get a very interesting and useful perspective on government and how it operates. And I am convinced that local government is the hardest job in the world. At the federal level, so much of it is policy, and there's very little service delivery in terms of picking up the trash or plowing the streets when the snow comes, or making sure folks get their food stamps or their welfare payments and get their education. It's so much harder at the local level.
Who ran the Intergovernmental Affairs office at the White House?
Jack Watson.
And what were you to him?
I was his staff assistant. And
how many others were there on that committee?
In that office, there were probably about 10 of us. Yeah. And it was a very active office. And we used to do things like the president's briefing books when he was going out on the road to speak. And we pulled together the data on, who our friends were in this city that he was going to, and what kind of special grants that city might have gotten, what the issues were that the governor or the mayor was most concerned about, those kinds of things, so that the president was prepared when he waded into those waters, that he wouldn't be surprised.
And those were the days when you could literally just drive right into the White House.
Oh yeah, you could. Absolutely could.
And you worked in the White House?
I worked in the old executive office building, which is right on the White House grounds.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Carter wasn't there for 2 terms. What happened when he lost the election?
Oh, it was awful. As you know, Carter was an outsider. I mean, he'd come here from Georgia, and as hard as he tried, and he never fully embraced Washington, Washington never fully embraced him. He never embraced corporate America. Corporate America didn't embrace him. So you had a situation where one perspective is just the employment perspective. Typically, when an administration changes, everybody gets a job because the boss looks out for his folks, and people are excited to have somebody who's been in the White House, who knows the way government works, who can be helpful. Well, that didn't happen after the Carter administration for two reasons. One is because Carter was the outsider and he wasn't able to place many of his people. But the second thing was there was a total change from Democrat to Republican. And so that was also a barrier. So I remember that Ivanhoe Donaldson, who at the time was the Director of Employment Services for the District of Columbia, literally came to the White House and ran a session for all of us who were going to be unemployed, giving us the appropriate forms and telling us how we could collect unemployment from the district. And he would take the forms back with him, or you can come back later, and if you weren't sure you wanted to put in for unemployment. The district was very helpful in trying to make the transition for those of us who were going to be unemployed easier. But it was pretty interesting times.
And you went from there to district government, am I right?
Yeah, eventually I went to district government. I resisted going to district government for a while, and I thought maybe I wanted to try to go back to a law firm. And there was just such a crush of people. Everybody was trying to get into law firms. I had not been in some ways senior enough at the White House to make me really valuable to a law firm. And at the end of the day, I guess about May or June, Ivanhoe offered me a job, and I told him I didn't want to work for district government. And he said to me, "Wait a minute, I'm offering you a job that you're qualified to do, and you're telling me no. I'll deny unemployment benefits." And I said, "Ivanhoe, you wouldn't do that, would you?" He said, "Try me, sister."
Why didn't you want to work for DC government?
Because the district had an awful reputation, and particularly he wanted me to come work for the Summer Youth Employment Program. And as you know, during Marion's early years, he greatly expanded the jobs for summer kids, for kids in summer. And it was a grand ideal, but it wasn't necessarily well managed in some of the early years. It had its difficulties. And Ivanhoe had become Director of Employment Services, and he wanted to make sure it worked right. And he wanted to make sure, from a legal perspective, that they were complying with all the legal and regulatory requirements that the Department of Labor had with respect to the program. And so that's the piece of it he wanted me to do. And I was really concerned about the fact that the program had such a history of running badly. I didn't want to be tainted by it. But I actually did go there, and it worked out just fine. I only spent a little while there, basically got through the program, and then I actually went to environmental services at the time, and then became a special assistant to Bill Johnson, who was the director of the agency, before I went downtown and became director of InterGovernmental Relations for the district.
And so tell me about the time when you were with the InterGovernmental Relations office.
Well, that was a fascinating time. That's the liaison between the executive branch of government, the Council of the District of Columbia, and the Congress of the United States. So it was my responsibility. I had a staff of about 15 people. It was my responsibility to, one, help the mayor develop his legislative agenda, get the legislation drafted, get it down to the council, try to get it through the council. Secondly, I had the responsibility for reviewing and helping coordinate the executive comments on all legislation that was introduced by council members. Thirdly, I had the responsibility for preparing various nominees for governmental positions or for boards and commissions who were going down to the council for hearings, helping them prepare their testimony, getting them ready for their hearings. And the final piece was the liaison between the district and the Congress, so that legislation pending on the Hill that either was requested by the district, introduced and affected the district, it was my responsibility to coordinate our response to or comment on. And so it was a very interesting and challenging position. It was one that taxed my ability to be diplomatic sometime, because the one thing you learn about legislators, I suppose all people are like this, but it seemed to me legislators are particularly possessed of this, is that they don't necessarily have principles. I mean, they take positions on legislation that may not be principled. It may be based on some pet issue or peak at the moment, or sometimes they're just not very thoughtful. It was just frustrating to me sometimes when you'd see a legislator either make a comment or vote in a way that seemed totally inconsistent with any position he or she had ever taken before, and you couldn't quite figure it out. And you knew that it's probably the side of the bed they got out of that morning, or whoever it had whispered in their ear last, and it had nothing to do with principles, and that was frustrating for me.
This was your first job where you were in charge of the office?
Yes, absolutely.
And how difficult was that?
At that time, I was probably, let's see, it was 72. So I was probably about 49. No, yeah, about 49. 39, sorry, 39. About 39. And I had never managed anything before. Marion told me I could do it, therefore I could, right? Marion had this way of assuming people could do anything. And he was convinced that if he gave them the opportunity, they would do it. And I am very grateful to Marion for giving me the opportunity. I'm sure a lot of people would not have done it. I was clearly unproven. I had not done this before. And I learned a lot from him. I remember after one meeting, he and I had been present, and it was with Councilmember Charlene Drew Jarvis. And so after the meeting, he says, "Pauline, you've got to learn to control your body language." What are you talking about? You've got to learn to control your body language. And it is something that I've worked on a lot. I still don't do it very well, but I do it better than I used to, because if it came into my head, you could see it on my face, because I telegraphed everything. And he'd tell me, "You could never play poker." And yeah, you're right, I could never play poker. And I've learned to control some of that. Not all of it, but I've controlled some of it.
You have spoken favorably about Marion Barry and others, but him in particular. Have you maintained a positive relationship with him over the years?
I've maintained a relationship. I mean, I don't see him regularly. Look, I have a lot of admiration and respect for Marion. I think the great tragedy of Marion Barry is that he'll only be remembered for his personal excesses. But for those who are around in the early years, I think he deserves a lot of credit, and this city will forever benefit from things he did, like location of the Reeves Center at 14th NU, his insistence on metro stops there. Things as simple as the super can, which reduced the cost of trash collection, reduced the number of injuries that resulted when the guys were hoisting the barrels. I mean, it reduced the rodent population. I mean, there are any number of things that you can detail that he deserves the credit for. The sad thing is we will only remember his personal excesses, I think.
Do you mentor young women?
All the time, every chance I get.
In what
Men
ways?
too.
Okay. In what ways?
You know, there was always somebody there for me to, you know, drag me along to this thing or that thing, to have an open door if I needed to have somebody to talk to. I try always to have an open door. I try always to make time to sit and chat with young people if they want to sit and chat with me. I have them over for dinner. You know, last week I was going to the National Partnership for Women and Families, and I'm on the board there and had gotten a table. And so I just called up some young women at some firms and said, hey, what are you doing for lunch? Come go to this with me. And hopefully it's an opportunity for them and me to get together, but hopefully it's also a way of saying to them that you need to be engaged as well in some of these things that are going to make life better for women and kids in the future. This young woman, there's a, I'm babbling here. There's an organization called GWAC, this Greater Washington chapter of
National Bar.
yeah, and I spoke to them, I guess 2 years ago, and met a young woman whose name is Chelsea, delightful young woman, and we just clicked. And so, you know, every 3 or 4 months we have dinner. We talk about how she's doing. She talks about how I'm doing. But it's, you know, I didn't have a lot of people who look like me who were lawyers when I was growing up. I mean, I didn't know any lawyers of color when I was growing up. I met my first lawyers of color after I came to Washington, D.C. But there weren't a lot of black women lawyers who I could go and sit down with and, you know, say, help me with this, or let me, you know, just find somebody who's been through it, who I can chat with. And I want to be there for folks who are looking for somebody who's been there, who's done what they may want to do, to let them know that, you know, they can do it too.
What do you tell young women about how they should or how they can distinguish themselves professionally in the bar?
In the bar, you limited to that. You know, the first thing I tell them is that you got to bring your A game. You've really got to work hard. You've got to produce a good product. You've got to behave in an ethical fashion. You've got to conduct yourself in a way that brings pride to you, to your firm, and whatever. You know, I also remind people that Washington's a very small town in many ways. So you should never, ever assume that when you go out in the evening or you're hanging out on the weekend, that you may not, that you should never assume that you won't run into somebody who happens to be a client or who one day may be a client. So I always remind people that you have to ever be sensitive to how you conduct yourself, because you never know who might next be your client. The other thing is you never burn bridges. You know, I like to tell this story because it is a reminder that even at a personal level, there are things you have to remember about what may be beneficial sometime later. you just never know where you might have an opportunity from a business perspective to, find a client.